The Alpha King had not slept beside another living soul in 12 years. Yet that night, long before anyone understood why, he stopped in the middle of a snowstorm and carried an unconscious Omega servant into his private chambers with his own hands. The iron gates of Blackthorn Palace groaned against the wind as snow swept across the courtyard in silver waves. Servants hurried with lowered heads, shoulders tight beneath heavy wool cloaks, desperate to avoid the storm and the king's temper at the same time. Then someone screamed. Not loud, just sharp enough to cut through the wind. A young woman lay collapsed beside the frozen fountain, her pale hair dusted white with snow, one trembling hand still clutching a basket of crushed herbs against her chest. Alira, the lowest-ranked Omega in the Eastern Servant Wing. No one moved toward her. A guard glanced once at the girl curled against the stone, then looked away fast. "Don't touch her," another muttered under his breath. "If the king smells weakness tonight, someone's dead." The courtyard fell silent again except for the howl of wind threading through the castle towers. Alira's breathing hitched weakly. Frost clung to her lashes. One of the maids swallowed hard and took half a step forward anyway, but the sound of approaching boots stopped her cold. Heavy, slow, measured. Every servant immediately dropped their gaze to the ground. Alpha King Kalen crossed the courtyard draped in black fur and dark leather, snow gathering across his broad shoulders without melting. He looked carved from winter itself, emotionless, untouchable. The guards straightened instantly, fear sharpening their posture. No one dared speak while he passed. Then his eyes landed on the girl in the snow. The wind seemed to quiet around him, just for a second. One guard cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, we'll remove her before dawn." Kalen said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the small figure curled against the stone. Alira shivered once, barely noticeable, but her fingers tightened weakly around the broken herb basket like she was trying to protect it even unconscious. Something changed in the air, tiny, strange. The king stepped closer. Snow crushed beneath his boots. Everyone watched him carefully now, waiting for disgust, irritation, indifference, anything familiar. Instead, he stopped directly beside her. A long pause followed. Too long. The maids exchanged frightened looks without lifting their heads. Kalen never paused, never hesitated. Yet there he stood, staring down at an Omega servant no one else considered important enough to save. A cold gust swept through the courtyard, lifting strands of Alira's pale hair across her face. The king's hand moved before anyone expected it to. He knelt. The nearest guard physically flinched. Kalen brushed the snow away from her cheek with two gloved fingers, slow enough that several servants forgot to breathe. Her skin looked dangerously cold against the black leather of his glove. Then his jaw tightened, only slightly, but everyone saw it. "She's burning up," one healer whispered from the staircase. The king slid one arm beneath Alira's shoulders and lifted her effortlessly against his chest. The movement sent visible shock through the courtyard. Even the storm suddenly felt quieter. Alira stirred faintly against him, her forehead pressing weakly against the dark fur lining his coat. Kalen looked down at her for one unreadable second. Then he spoke. Calm, low, final. "Prepare my chambers." A servant dropped an oil lantern. Glass shattered across the stone. No one even looked at it, because the real disaster had already happened. The emotionless Alpha King had just carried an Omega into the one place no Omega had ever been allowed to enter. The doors to the king's chambers closed with a deep metallic thud that seemed to shake the entire floor. Every servant inside froze instantly. No one spoke above a whisper in this room. No one breathed too loudly either. Blackthorn Palace had hundreds of chambers, lined with silver, velvet, and carved stone. But this room felt different, colder, older. The air carried cedar smoke, iron, and the faint scent of winter rain drifting through partially opened balcony doors. Alira looked impossibly small against the enormous dark bed at the center of the room, her pale face nearly blending into the silk pillows beneath her. Snowmelt dampened strands of hair against her temples. Her breathing remained uneven, fast one second, too shallow the next. 3 healers moved carefully around her with steaming bowls of herbs and clean cloths, though their eyes kept darting toward the same figure standing near the windows. Kalen had not removed his gloves or his sword belt. He stood motionless, with one hand behind his back, while wind stirred the black curtains around him. The fire crackled low beside the bed. Orange light flashed briefly across the silver rings on his fingers before fading again into shadow. "Her fever's climbing," an older healer murmured quietly while pressing a cloth against Alira's forehead. "We need to lower her temperature now." Another servant reached for the edge of Alira's dress sleeve to check for frost damage. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. "Enough!" The word cut through the room immediately. Everyone stopped. Even the fire seemed quieter afterward. Kalen hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. The servant slowly withdrew her hand, pulse visibly jumping in her throat. A long silence followed. Then the king finally stepped away from the window. Heavy boots crossed the marble floor with deliberate calm. He stopped beside the bed and looked down at the unconscious Omega without expression. Still, something felt wrong, or unfamiliar, because he kept looking. A healer carefully cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, prolonged exposure to the storm weakened her badly. If she doesn't wake by morning—" He hesitated. No one wanted to finish that sentence in front of an alpha king. Kalen's gaze remained fixed on Alira's face. Pale lashes, shaking breath, one tiny crease between her brows even in sleep, like her body still expected danger. The king reached down suddenly. Several servants stiffened, but he only adjusted the heavy fur blanket higher around her shoulders after noticing another shiver move through her. The room went completely still. One maid accidentally dropped a silver spoon into a medicine tray. The sharp clang echoed loudly. She nearly collapsed trying to apologize. Kalen didn't even glance at her, which somehow felt worse. "More wood," he said quietly. "Keep the fire burning." The servants exchanged startled looks before rushing to obey. Flames soon climbed higher inside the massive stone hearth, warming the room inch by inch. Snow continued tapping softly against the balcony doors. Alira stirred weakly against the blankets. A faint sound escaped her throat. Not words, just discomfort. Kalen's eyes shifted toward her instantly, too fast, like he'd been listening for every breath. The older healer noticed it too. His hands paused briefly while crushing herbs into a steaming bowl. "Interesting," he muttered under his breath before quickly lowering his head again. The king's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Alira's trembling worsened moments later. Her fingers curled weakly into the sheets as another wave of fever rolled through her body. One of the younger healers stepped closer with fresh medicine, but Kalen moved first. He took the cup from the healer's hands himself. Silence spread across the room again. Nobody had ever seen the Alpha King serve anyone, especially not an Omega servant. He slid one arm carefully beneath Alira's shoulders, lifting her just enough to bring the cup to her lips. Her head leaned weakly against his chest for one brief second before he stilled completely. The room felt suspended in time. Alira swallowed only a little before drifting again. Kalen lowered her back onto the pillows with surprising care. Then he remained there beside the bed instead of stepping away. Minutes passed, then another. Outside, midnight bells echoed through the distant towers of Blackthorn Palace. Still, the king did not leave. By 2 a.m, half the palace already knew something was wrong. Not because anyone had seen the king lose control. Kalen never lost control. That was exactly the problem. The guards outside his chambers had not been dismissed once. The healers had not been sent away. And the candles inside the royal corridor were still burning long after midnight, their gold light flickering beneath the doors like restless shadows. Servants passing through the lower halls slowed unconsciously when they reached that corridor. Some crossed themselves before hurrying on. Others whispered in tight voices that vanished the second footsteps approached. "He's still in there." "Impossible." "No, I heard the bells myself. He hasn't left once." Inside the chamber, the fire had burned low again. Rain now tapped softly against the balcony windows, replacing the earlier storm. The room smelled faintly of pine smoke and crushed lavender from the healer's remedies scattered across the table beside the bed. Alira's fever had not broken. Sweat dampened loose strands of pale hair against her neck, while her breathing shifted unevenly beneath the heavy blankets. One moment calm, the next strained, like her body couldn't decide whether to fight or surrender. Kalen sat beside the bed in complete silence. His elbows rested against the carved wooden chair, gloved fingers loosely clasped before him. He had not moved for nearly an hour. The older healer noticed first, not the stillness, the listening. Every time Alira's breathing changed even slightly, the king's eyes lifted immediately. Precise, instant, like a wolf tracking movement in darkness. The healer quietly packed away unused herbs into leather pouches, pretending not to notice. Nobody wanted the king aware that they were watching him too carefully. Then Alira made a small sound, barely more than a shaky breath. Kalen straightened before anyone else reacted. Her fingers twitched weakly across the blankets. Another restless sound escaped her throat, softer this time. "Easy," the healer murmured while stepping closer with fresh water. Alira suddenly flinched hard against the pillows, as if fleeing something inside a dream. The cup slipped from the healer's hands and shattered across the marble floor. Water spread instantly between the cracks in the stone. Everyone froze. The sharp sound echoed through the chamber. One servant immediately dropped to her knees to clean the broken glass, hands shaking badly enough to cut herself against a silver edge. She sucked in a breath. Tiny beads of blood surfaced against her skin. Kalen's attention never shifted from the bed, which somehow unsettled the room even more. Alira's breathing turned uneven again, faster now, her brows pulled together faintly as another tremor moved through her shoulders. Then suddenly, blindly, she reached outward. Her hand found the king's wrist. Silence crashed over the room. The servant kneeling on the floor stopped moving entirely. The older healer's eyes widened before he quickly lowered his head. No Omega touched the Alpha King without permission. Everyone in Blackthorn knew that. Kalen looked down slowly at the pale hand gripping his sleeve. Small, weak, barely holding on. Nobody breathed. One heartbeat passed, then another. The king did not pull away. Instead, his gaze lingered on her trembling fingers wrapped around black leather. Something unreadable flickered across his face before vanishing again beneath stillness. Alira's breathing eased slightly moments later, as if her body recognized something safe before her mind could. Outside the chamber, distant thunder rolled across the mountains. One of the guards shifted nervously near the doors. Another muttered under his breath, "This isn't normal." Inside, the fire cracked softly. Kalen adjusted his arm without disturbing her grip. A tiny movement, careful, deliberate. The older healer stared openly this time before catching himself. "Your Majesty," he said cautiously, "you should rest." No response. The king's eyes remained fixed on Alira's sleeping face. Minutes stretched quietly afterward until the healer finally bowed and retreated toward the doors with the servants behind him. None of them wanted to leave first. None of them wanted to stay either. The doors closed softly behind them. Now only rain and firelight filled the chamber. Alira shifted faintly against the pillows again. Her grip tightened once more around Kalen's wrist. And for the first time in years, the Alpha King stayed exactly where he was. The first scream came just before dawn. Not loud, choked, startled. A maid stumbled backward near the king's chambers with both hands clapped over her mouth while silver trays crashed against the floor around her. Guards snapped toward the sound instantly. "Quiet," one hissed, grabbing her arm before the noise traveled deeper into the corridor. But it was already too late. 3 servants had seen it. By sunrise, nearly the entire upper palace had heard some version of the same impossible rumor. The Alpha King was still inside. The doors to his chambers had not opened once all night. Rain had faded hours ago, leaving only pale gray light spilling through the towering windows of Blackthorn Palace. Cold morning air drifted silently across the stone halls, while servants moved in tense clusters, whispering behind lowered heads. Nobody understood what was happening. Worse, nobody understood why the king had not ordered the Omega removed yet. Inside the chamber, the fire burned softer now, casting long amber shadows across the room. Alira's fever had finally begun to ease, though exhaustion still weighed heavily against every breath she took. Damp cloths rested folded in a basin nearby, beside untouched cups of tea gone cold hours earlier. Caleb remained seated beside the bed. He had not changed clothes. Dark circles faintly shadowed beneath his eyes, almost invisible unless someone looked too closely. No one ever dared look that closely. A knock sounded carefully at the chamber doors. Once, then again. "Enter," the command came low and rougher than usual. The oldest healer stepped inside carrying fresh medicine, followed by two younger attendants who immediately froze upon entering. Their eyes flicked toward the king, then toward the bed, then quickly away again. Alira shifted faintly beneath the blankets at the sound of movement. One of the attendants instinctively stepped forward to help adjust her pillows, but Kaylin rose before she could reach the bedside. The movement startled everyone. The attendant nearly stopped breathing altogether. Kaylin took the pillows himself and slid one hand behind Alira's shoulders with measured care. Her head tilted weakly against his arm while he adjusted the bedding. The room remained dead silent except for the crackle of burning wood. One attendant lowered her gaze so quickly she almost dropped the medicine tray. This was wrong. Every instinct in the room knew it. The Alpha King did not touch people gently, especially not Omegas. Alira blinked suddenly against the morning light. Small movement, slow, confused. The older healer straightened at once. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't force yourself." Her lashes fluttered weakly before her eyes finally opened. Pale blue, dazed from fever. The unfamiliar ceiling came into focus first, then the black stone walls, then the king standing impossibly close beside her bed. Fear hit immediately, sharp, visible. Alira jerked backwards so suddenly the blankets tangled around her legs. Her pulse visibly jumped beneath her throat. "No." The word broke apart into panic as she tried forcing herself upright, despite the weakness still shaking through her body. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean—" She nearly slipped from the bed. Kaylin caught her arm instantly before she hit the floor. The contact froze her completely. Alira stared at his hand gripping her wrist like she expected punishment to follow. The attendants looked horrified too. One quietly backed toward the wall. Everyone in Blackthorn knew the law. No servant entered the king's private chambers without direct summons. No Omega touched the king without permission. Alira's breathing became shallow, fast. She tried pulling her arm free on instinct. Kaylin let go immediately. Too immediately. A strange pause followed. Tiny, barely noticeable, but there. The king stepped back half a pace instead of closer. His jaw tightened once before he looked toward the healer rather than at her. "She's still weak." The healer nodded carefully. She should remain resting another day. Alira's eyes widened slightly at that. Another day here? Fear flickered visibly across her face. Kaylin noticed. Of course he noticed. His gaze lingered on the trembling edge of her fingers clutching the blankets. Then, unexpectedly, he lowered himself onto one knee beside the bed so she no longer had to crane her neck upward to look at him. The attendant stared openly this time. The Alpha King had never lowered himself for anyone, not once. Kaylin's voice came quieter now, controlled, but slower than usual, like each word required thought before release. "You are safe here." Alira's breath caught softly. Outside the chamber doors, another tray suddenly shattered somewhere down the corridor. By late afternoon, the palace had grown quieter. Not calmer, just quieter in the way forests became quiet before heavy snow. Servants stopped gossiping whenever footsteps approached. Guards exchanged looks without speaking. Even the musicians in the Western Hall played softer than usual, their melodies barely drifting through the endless corridors of Blackthorn Palace. Inside the king's chambers, the fire crackled steadily, while pale winter light spilled across the floor in long silver shapes. Alira sat near the edge of the bed, wrapped in a dark wool blanket far too large for her frame. The fever had faded from her skin, leaving only exhaustion behind. A tray of untouched food rested nearby: bread, warm broth, tea gone cold again. She kept glancing toward the chamber doors every few minutes, waiting, listening, like a startled animal expecting the trap to finally close. Kaelin had not returned since morning. At first, that should have relieved her. Instead, the silence pressed strangely against the room. One maid carefully brushed fresh logs into the fire before bowing quickly. "His Majesty ordered the room kept warm," she murmured, without lifting her eyes. Alira's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. "Why?" The maid hesitated too long. "I don't know." That answer followed Alira everywhere now. Nobody knew. Not the healers, not the guards, not even the servants closest to the throne. Why her? Why this room? Why had the Alpha King carried her through the storm himself, instead of leaving her in the servant quarters like anyone else would have? The questions hung in every corner of the palace. Alira could feel them even when no one spoke aloud. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Another servant entered, carrying folded dresses over her arms. Simple clothes, better quality than anything Alira had ever owned. "For you," the servant whispered quickly, "from the royal tailor." Alira blinked at the fabrics in confusion. There must be a mistake. The servant's expression tightened immediately. No mistake. Then she rushed out before another word could be spoken. The chamber doors closed again. Alira stared down at the clothing for a long moment before carefully setting it aside, untouched. Outside, bells rang faintly across the palace towers as evening approached. The sound usually marked the changing of guards. Tonight it sounded heavier somehow, more watchful. Alira slowly slid her feet onto the cold floor, despite the lingering weakness in her legs. She needed to leave before this became worse, before the king changed his mind, before someone accused her of something she could never defend herself against. Her hands shook slightly while fastening the borrowed cloak around her shoulders. She moved quietly toward the doors. Slow steps, careful breathing. The room itself almost seemed to hold still around her. Then the doors opened before she could reach them. Alira stopped instantly. Kaelin stepped inside, with snow dusting the shoulders of his black coat. Cold air swept into the chamber behind him before the guards quickly sealed the doors shut again. For one brief second, surprise crossed his face when he saw her standing, tiny, gone almost immediately. But there, Alira lowered her gaze at once. "Your Majesty." Her voice came softer than she intended. Kaelin's eyes moved over her slowly, checking the steadiness of her posture, the color returning to her face, the absence of fever in her breathing. He noticed the cloak clasped tightly in her hands, the untouched food, the folded dresses pushed aside near the bed. Silence stretched. Then his gaze shifted toward the door behind her. Understanding settled quietly across his features. Alira stepped back instinctively. "I was only going to return to the servant wing." The room became very still. One of the guards outside adjusted his stance, armor scraping faintly against stone. Kaelin removed his gloves one finger at a time without speaking, deliberate, controlled, but slower than usual. "No," he said at last. Not harsh, not angry, somehow worse because of how calm it sounded. Alira's pulse visibly jumped beneath her throat. "Your Majesty, I don't belong here." Another pause. Kaelin looked at her for so long the firewood cracked sharply beside them, making Alira flinch. His eyes lowered briefly toward the blanket slipping from one of her shoulders, before lifting again. "That," he said quietly, "is becoming a problem." The rumor should have died by the next morning. That was how Blackthorn Palace survived scandals. Quiet them. Bury them. Pretend nothing unusual ever happened beneath the crown. Instead, the whispers multiplied. Servants stopped speaking when Alira walked through the halls escorted by royal guards. Nobles arriving for court sessions suddenly lingered longer near corridor balconies, pretending to admire the snowfall, while their eyes searched for glimpses of the mysterious Omega the king refused to dismiss. Even the palace wolves had grown restless. Low growls echoed occasionally from the lower courtyards whenever Alira crossed certain hallways, as though the entire castle could feel something shifting beneath the surface. Alira noticed it most during dinner. She sat alone at the far end of a long private table inside one of the smaller royal chambers, while servants moved nervously around her with silver trays and crystal goblets. Nobody met her eyes directly anymore. Not out of respect, fear. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted steadily across the mountains surrounding Blackthorn Palace, softening the world in white silence. Kaelin had not arrived yet. The empty seat at the head of the table seemed to tighten the entire room anyway. Alira barely touched the food placed before her. Every clink of silverware made her shoulders tense. Finally, unable to endure the suffocating quiet any longer, she pushed back her chair. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. A nearby servant immediately lowered her gaze. Another nearly dropped a wine bottle, trying not to react. Then the chamber doors opened. Conversations stopped instantly. Kaelin entered, still wearing his black council coat, silver clasps undone near the collar like he had left a meeting unfinished. Cold air swept in behind him. His eyes found Alira immediately. Always immediately. The servants noticed that too. Of course they did. Alira stepped back from the table before he fully crossed the room. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "please let me return to the eastern wing." Silence. Kaelin removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time. The motion should have looked calm. Somehow, it didn't. "No." The answer came faster this time, less controlled. Alira swallowed hard. "People are talking." "People always talk." "About you." That made him pause. Tiny crack, barely visible, but real. His gaze lowered briefly toward the untouched plate before returning to her face. "Did someone threaten you?" The question caught her off guard, not because of the words, because of how quickly he asked them. Like that possibility mattered more than the rumors themselves. Alira shook her head immediately. "No." A lie. Two servants near the kitchens had gone silent when she passed earlier. One had muttered curse-born beneath her breath. Another crossed herself afterward. Small things, but they stayed with her. Kaelin watched her too closely not to notice the hesitation before her answer. His jaw tightened faintly. Before either of them could speak again, hurried footsteps thundered down the corridor outside. The chamber doors burst open hard enough to strike the stone wall behind them. A royal messenger stumbled inside, breathing heavily, snow still clinging to his cloak. "Your Majesty, the council is demanding immediate audience." Every servant in the room stiffened. The messenger looked toward Alira for only half a second before quickly dropping his gaze again. That was enough. Kaelin's expression cooled instantly. Dangerous now. "On what matter?" The messenger hesitated. "The Omega." Silence hit the room like a blade. Alira's fingers curled tightly against the edge of the chair beside her. Around them, servants slowly backed away without realizing they were doing it. Instinct. Pure instinct. The messenger swallowed hard. Several noble houses believe her presence inside the royal chambers dishonors the throne. Another pause. Longer this time. Kaelin looked toward the windows overlooking the snowy cliffs beyond the palace walls. The room waited. The messenger waited. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Then the king spoke without turning around. "Tell the council," he said calmly. "They may wait." The messenger blinked once in confusion. "Your Majesty?" Kaelin finally looked back at him, slow, controlled. But something colder had entered the room now. Something no one had felt from him in years. "I said," the Alpha King repeated softly, "they may wait." The council chamber had not been this crowded in years. Nobles lined the upper balconies shoulder to shoulder beneath towering black banners marked with the silver wolf crest of Blackthorn. Guards stood rigid along the marble walls with hands resting near their weapons, though their eyes kept shifting toward the massive doors at the end of the hall. The entire palace felt stretched too tight, one wrong word away from snapping. Snow hammered against the stained glass windows overhead, while dozens of low conversations rippled through the chamber like restless waves. He's lost control. Over an Omega servant? Impossible. Then why hasn't he sent her away? Alira stood alone near the bottom of the staircase leading toward the throne platform, wrapped in a dark cloak that suddenly felt far too thin beneath the weight of hundreds of eyes. No one stood near her, not the servants, not the guards. A clear circle had formed around her without instruction, as if proximity itself had become dangerous. She kept her gaze lowered toward the polished floor, while whispers rose and broke apart above her head. Every sound echoed louder inside the chamber, boots shifting, rings tapping impatiently against wooden armrests, fabric rustling whenever another noble leaned closer to spread fresh rumors. Then the chamber doors opened. Silence crashed through the hall instantly. Kaelin entered, flanked by 2 royal guards, though neither man could fully match the cold authority radiating from the Alpha King himself. His black coat swept behind him as he crossed the chamber with measured steps, silver wolf insignia catching briefly beneath the torchlight. No one spoke while he passed. Several nobles lowered their eyes completely. Others watched him too carefully. Waiting. Testing. Kaelin reached the throne platform and stopped. For 1 second, his gaze drifted toward Alira standing below. Tiny pause, barely visible. Yet the nearest council members noticed immediately. One elder leaned back slowly in his chair, expression darkening. The king seated himself at last. "Begin." His voice rolled across the chamber, low and controlled. An older council lord rose first, robes dragging heavily across the marble floor. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "this matter concerns the dignity of the throne." Murmurs of agreement spread quickly through the balconies. Alira's fingers tightened beneath her cloak. The council lord continued. "An unidentified Omega servant has remained inside the royal chambers for days. The court demands explanation." Kaelin remained still, too still. Snow rattled violently against the stained glass overhead before fading again into tense silence. "She was ill," the king answered simply. A few nobles exchanged disbelieving looks. Another council member stood abruptly before the first could respond. Younger, sharper. "With respect, Your Majesty, no servant has ever been granted access to your private residence, especially not an Omega." More murmurs, louder now. Someone near the upper balcony scoffed openly. Alira could feel the room turning against her in waves. Kaelin's expression never changed, but one hand tightened once against the carved armrest of the throne before relaxing again. Tiny crack. There and gone. "The matter should have ended once her condition stabilized," the younger lord pressed, "yet she remains under royal protection." The final words echoed harder than expected. Royal protection. The chamber reacted instantly. Several nobles started speaking over one another, while servants near the walls lowered their heads further. A guard near the staircase shifted uneasily as tension climbed through the room. Alira swallowed hard and finally lifted her eyes. Big mistake. Half the chamber was already staring at her openly now, some curious, others disgusted. One noblewoman whispered something sharp behind a jeweled fan that made the people around her laugh quietly. Alira's shoulders pulled tighter beneath the cloak. Kaelin saw that too. Of course he did. The king leaned back slowly against the throne. Calm outside, dangerous underneath. "Enough," he said. The single word silenced most of the chamber immediately. Most. One elder councilman rose anyway, gray-haired, powerful, old enough to remember kings before Kaelin. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he said carefully, but the court cannot ignore what this looks like. The chamber held its breath. The elder's gaze shifted toward Alira. An Omega influencing the throne has destroyed pacts before. Several nobles nodded instantly. Others began whispering again, louder now, more confident. The room was slipping, losing shape, losing order. Alira took one small step backward without meaning to. The movement caught Kaelin's attention immediately. His eyes followed her. Then something changed. Subtle, cold, final. The king rose from the throne. Every voice in the chamber died at once. No one in the chamber moved after the king stood. Even the storm outside seemed to pull back from the windows. Snow slid silently down stained glass, while torchlight trembled across the black marble floor beneath Kaelin's boots. The Alpha King descended the throne steps slowly, one measured step at a time, and every noble in the room tracked him with visible unease. Not because he looked angry. Kaelin had looked angry before. This was different, colder, controlled in a way that felt far more dangerous. Alira's pulse hammered unevenly as he stopped beside her. Close enough now that she caught the familiar scent of winter cedar and smoke clinging to his coat. The same scent that had surrounded her the night she woke trembling from fever beneath heavy blankets in his chambers. The same scent she had felt when his hand steadied her before she fell from the bed. Tiny memories flashed through her chest too quickly to stop. The council elder straightened near the center of the chamber. "Your Majesty," he pressed carefully, though less confidently now, "the throne cannot appear compromised." Kaelin did not look at him. His gaze remained on Alira instead, on the slight tremor in her hands beneath the cloak, on the way she kept her shoulders tight as though bracing for impact that had not come yet. Then he noticed something else. Her fingers were cold. Again. The realization passed across his face in the smallest fracture, barely there, but real. Kaelin reached for her before the chamber understood what he intended. Gasps broke instantly through the balconies as the king removed one glove and closed his bare hand around hers in full view of the court. Silence shattered. Nobles surged to their feet. Several council members began speaking at once, while guards instinctively shifted closer to the throne platform. Alira froze completely beneath the weight of hundreds of horrified eyes. Kaelin ignored all of them. His thumb brushed once across the frozen edge of her knuckles, same careful motion as the night he brushed snow from her cheek in the courtyard. Callback. Intentional. The chamber felt it. "Your Majesty, enough." His voice cracked through the hall like thunder. Every sound stopped instantly. Kaelin finally turned toward the council, still holding Alira's hand. Openly now, deliberately. "You speak of corruption," slow step forward. "Of weakness," another. The elder councilman visibly stiffened beneath the king's gaze. Kaelin's expression remained unreadable, but something older moved underneath it now. Something exhausted. She collapsed alone in the snow while this palace walked past her. Silence. Every servant here saw it. Several heads lowered immediately across the chamber balconies. A maid near the rear doors pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Kaelin's eyes darkened slightly. "None of you moved." The accusation landed harder than shouting would have. Alira looked up at him then. Really looked. For the first time since entering the chamber, the king's composure no longer appeared untouchable. Tiny cracks had begun to spread through it. The slight delay before his next breath, the tension pulling along his jaw, the way his grip around her hand tightened unconsciously whenever voices in the chamber rose too sharply. The elder councilman tried again, though his voice sounded thinner now. "You would risk the authority of the throne for an Omega servant?" Another pause. This one longer. Heavy enough that the room almost leaned forward waiting for the answer. Kaelin looked down briefly toward Alira beside him. Her pale hair, the fear she tried hiding, the exhaustion still lingering beneath her eyes. Then his gaze lifted back toward the court. "No," he said quietly. "I am risking it for someone your precious throne forgot was human." Complete silence. Even the nobles in the upper balconies stopped breathing. Alira's eyes widened faintly. Across the hall, one council member slowly sank back into his chair like his legs had weakened beneath him. Another whispered something shaken under his breath. Kaelin released Alira's hand only long enough to remove the silver wolf crest fastened at his collar, the symbol of royal authority every ruler of Blackthorn carried from birth. The chamber stared in disbelief as he placed it directly into Alira's trembling hands, warm silver against cold skin. "If this palace wishes to challenge her," the Alpha King said softly, "they challenge me first." The palace changed after that night, not loudly. Blackthorn never changed loudly. It happened in pauses, in lowered eyes, in doors suddenly opening before Alira reached them instead of closing in her face. Snow continued falling across the mountains for 3 more days, covering the cliffs and towers in white silence, while rumors spread through every corridor faster than fire ever could. The Alpha King had chosen an Omega over his own council. Nobody said the words too boldly yet, but everyone felt them. Alira noticed the difference first in the servant halls. Conversations no longer stopped completely when she entered. Some still did. Others simply softened. One young maid even bowed to her by accident before turning pale and hurrying away with shaking hands. Another servant placed fresh flowers near her window without explanation. Tiny things, fragile things, but different. The royal wolf crest remained with her, wrapped carefully in dark cloth beside the bed each night like something too dangerous to touch for long. No council member demanded it returned. No one dared. Outside the king's chambers, guards who once avoided looking at her now stepped aside immediately whenever she approached. A few even bowed their heads. Not deeply, not formally, but enough for the shift to be felt, enough for the old order to crack. Kaelin said little in the days that followed. The council meetings grew shorter, colder. Several nobles left Blackthorn Palace entirely before winter ended. Others remained, though none challenged the king openly again. Not after what happened in the chamber. Not after they saw the way his eyes changed whenever Alira's name entered a conversation. That part frightened them most. More than anger, more than threats. Because the Alpha King had always ruled like stone, predictable in his distance, untouchable in his control. Now there was something human beneath it. And humans were dangerous when they finally found something they could not lose. Late one evening, Alira wandered alone through the upper balcony gardens overlooking the frozen cliffs beyond the palace walls. Lanterns swayed softly in the winter wind, while snow drifted through the black iron railings in thin silver spirals. She stopped beside the fountain where the ice had begun to thaw at the edges. The sound of approaching footsteps reached her a moment later. Slow, familiar. She did not turn immediately this time. Kaelin stopped beside her beneath the lantern glow, dark coat moving lightly in the wind. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt sharp between them, just careful. Alira rested her hands against the cold stone railing. "They still fear you," she said quietly. Kaelin's gaze remained on the snowy mountains below. They should. A faint breath of laughter escaped her before she could stop it. Small, soft. The sound seemed to catch him off guard. His eyes shifted toward her almost immediately. Tiny crack again. Alira looked down quickly after realizing what she had done, but not before noticing the tension in his shoulders loosen slightly for the first time since she had known him. Wind moved through the balcony garden, carrying the scent of snow and cedar between them. Somewhere deep inside the palace, distant bells marked midnight. Alira's eyelids felt heavy suddenly. The exhaustion from the past week still lingered in her bones, no matter how hard she tried hiding it. Kaelin noticed the moment she suppressed a yawn. Of course he did. "You should rest." She nodded once. Neither moved right away. Then, quietly, Alira held out the folded black cloth containing the royal crest. "This belongs to you." Kaelin looked at the cloth but made no move to take it. Instead, his gaze lifted slowly back to her face. "Keep it." Alira's fingers tightened around the silver beneath the fabric. Why? Another pause. Snow drifted softly across his dark hair, while lantern light flickered gold against the sharp lines of his face. The king stepped closer then, not enough to frighten her anymore, just enough that the cold wind no longer reached where she stood. Because, Kaelin said softly, Blackthorn already knows where it belongs. The words settled between them as the palace lights burned quietly against the winter dark, and somewhere beyond the snow-covered walls, an entire kingdom began learning that its emotionless Alpha King would never again sleep through the night if she was not safe beside him.